Estes Park, Colorado, September 15, 1972. The Rocky Mountain autumn painted Boulder County in shades of amber and rust, and Mark Ellison stood at his classroom window watching leaves spiral past the glass. At 28, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had found his calling early. Students at Boulder High respected him not just for his art classes, but for the way he listened when they spoke about Vietnam, about Nixon, about futures that felt increasingly uncertain. That Friday afternoon, Mark packed his worn leather satchel with the same methodical care he brought to everything: charcoal pencils, a small sketch pad, his thermos still warm from the coffee he'd made that morning. His hiking boots sat by the classroom door, already laced and ready. The janitor, sweeping nearby hallways, would later remember how Mark hummed something soft under his breath, a melody no one could identify. "See you Monday, Mr. Ellison," called out Ruth Holloway as she gathered her art supplies. She was 17, quiet in the way that suggested deep thoughts rather than shyness. Her painting showed a technical skill that surprised even Mark, though she rarely spoke during class discussions. "So have a good weekend, Ruth," he replied, not looking up from his grade book. If he had noticed the way she lingered by his desk, or how her fingers worried the silver chain at her throat, he never mentioned it to anyone. Mark's weekend plans were simple: drive up to the mountains, find a spot near Lily Lake, and spend 2 days sketching the aspens before their leaves fell. He'd done the same trip every autumn since moving to Colorado 3 years earlier. His landlord would later tell police that Mark had seemed excited, almost boyish, as he loaded his old Volkswagen van with camping gear and art supplies. The last confirmed sighting of Mark Ellison came from a gas station attendant in Lyons, who remembered selling him coffee and a map at 2:30 p.m. on Saturday, September 16th. The attendant noted Mark's cheerful demeanor and the fact that he'd asked specifically about back roads leading to somewhere quiet, away from the tourist trails. By Tuesday, when Mark failed to show up for his first period art class, the principal called his apartment. No answer. By Wednesday, Mark's brother drove up from Denver, used the spare key, and found everything exactly as Mark had left it, except for the camping gear, his art supplies, and Mark himself. The initial police report described Mark as an experienced hiker and responsible individual, with no known enemies or personal troubles. His bank account showed no unusual activity. His mail sat uncollected. His van was nowhere to be found. As September faded into October, and the first snow dusted the peaks, Mark Ellison had simply vanished into the vast wilderness of the Colorado Rockies, leaving behind only questions and the faint scent of turpentine that seemed to linger in his empty classroom for weeks. Boulder County, Colorado, October 1972 to June 1973. The search for Mark Ellison began with hope and the assumption that mountains, while dangerous, eventually give up their secrets. His brother, David, organized volunteer search parties that combed the hiking trails around Lily Lake and Bear Lake. Local outdoors clubs donated time and equipment. Even some of Mark's students joined weekend searches, carrying hand-drawn missing person flyers that Ruth Holloway had designed. But the Colorado wilderness in 1972 was vast and unforgiving, with over 54 peaks rising above 14,000 feet and thousands of square miles of backcountry. Searchers faced an impossible task. The first heavy snowfall came early that year, on October 8th, sealing mountain passes and making many areas inaccessible until spring. Mark's disappearance coincided with a particularly chaotic time in Boulder. Anti-war protests regularly shut down parts of the university campus. The police department was understaffed and dealing with drug-related incidents that seemed to multiply weekly. Detective Ray Morrison, assigned to Mark's case, was also handling 17 other missing person reports, most involving runaway teenagers or young men who had gone underground to avoid the draft. In those days, people disappeared on purpose all the time, Morrison would later reflect. The counterculture movement, the war, the general distrust of authority, it made our job damn near impossible. We'd get reports of missing persons who turned up 6 months later, living in communes in California or Canada. Mark's case fell through the cracks of circumstance and timing. His Volkswagen van was never found, despite being entered into a statewide database. Several reported sightings came to nothing. A van spotted near Nederland turned out to belong to a geology student. Another sighting near Ward was just a similar model with different license plates. The Holloway family lived on the outskirts of Lyons, where Thomas Holloway ran a small logging operation with his 2 brothers. Their property included several hundred acres of mountainous terrain and an old hunting cabin that the family had used for generations. When police interviewed Thomas about possible sightings in the area, he was cooperative but firm. He'd never met Mark Ellison and had seen no strangers on his property. Ruth Holloway returned to school after a week-long absence that her father explained as a family matter. Teachers noticed she seemed withdrawn, but attributed it to the stress of her senior year and college applications. Her art, however, became more intense. She painted landscapes that seemed to bleed sorrow, empty mountainsides under heavy skies, abandoned cabins surrounded by dark trees. By spring 1973, the official search had been suspended. David Ellison continued private searches whenever weather permitted, but as months passed with no trace of his brother, even he began to accept that Mark might never be found. The Rocky Mountains, after all, held countless secrets beneath their snow and stone. Mark's apartment was eventually cleaned out. His personal effects were boxed and stored in David's basement. Boulder High hired a new art teacher, and life continued its forward momentum. Only Ruth Holloway seemed unable to move on. Classmates later remembered how she would stare out windows during lessons, as if watching for someone who would never come. In June 1973, Thomas Holloway quietly sold his logging business and moved his family to Denver. Neighbors assumed it was financial pressure. The logging industry was struggling, and environmental regulations were making small operations increasingly difficult to maintain. The family left their mountain property vacant, including the old hunting cabin, where 3 generations of Holloways had spent weekends and holidays. No one thought to connect the Holloway family's sudden departure with Mark Ellison's disappearance. The 2 stories existed in separate spaces, one a missing person case growing cold, the other a family seeking new opportunities in the city. In 1972, before databases and instant communication, such connections often remained invisible, buried under the weight of time and changing seasons. Estes Park, Colorado, October 15, 2025. Sarah and Michael Chen had dreamed of owning a mountain retreat since their college days in California. When they found the old Holloway cabin listed for sale, barely more than a shell of weathered logs and broken windows, they saw potential where others saw problems. The price was right, the location spectacular, and the seller seemed eager to close quickly. It needs everything, the real estate agent had warned them. New foundation, new roof, complete electrical and plumbing. You're basically buying the land and hoping the structure is salvageable. But Sarah, an architect, and Michael, a contractor, thrived on renovation challenges. They spent their first weekend at the property clearing decades of debris, rotted furniture, old newspapers from the 1980s, rusted tools, and an inexplicable collection of empty paint cans. The cabin had clearly been abandoned for years, possibly decades. The floorboards presented their biggest challenge. Original pine planks, installed sometime in the 1950s, had warped and separated over the years. Water damage from a leaking roof had rotted several sections completely through. Michael decided to replace the entire floor, a job that required removing each board individually to assess the underlying structure. It was Sarah who noticed the inconsistency. In the main room, most of the floorboards ran east to west, following the cabin's natural grain. But in one corner, near what had once been a stone fireplace, 5 boards ran north to south. They were also newer, the wood lighter, the nail heads different in style and placement. "Honey, come look at this," Sarah called, running her fingers along the irregular seam. These boards were added later, different wood, different installation pattern. Michael examined the area with the practiced eye of someone who had renovated dozens of homes. "You're right. Someone replaced these boards, probably in a hurry. Look how the spacing is off." When they pried up the first mismatched board, the smell hit them immediately, earthy, musty, with an undertone that made both of them step back instinctively. Beneath the floorboards lay not the expected dirt or stone foundation, but a carefully excavated rectangular space, perhaps 4 feet by 6 feet and 2 feet deep. The wooden trunk they found buried in that space was clearly handmade, constructed from the same pine that formed the cabin's walls. It had been wrapped in heavy plastic, then sealed with what appeared to be candle wax. Despite decades underground, the container remained remarkably preserved. "We should call someone," Sarah whispered, though neither of them made any immediate move toward their phones. The trunk's presence felt almost ceremonial, too deliberate to be mere storage, too hidden to be innocent. When they finally opened the trunk, 3 hours later, under the supervision of Park County Sheriff's deputies, the contents told a story that had waited 53 years to be heard. Carefully folded clothing, a man's flannel shirt, hiking boots, blue jeans with a leather belt still threaded through the loops, art supplies, a wooden box of charcoal pencils, a sketch pad with several drawings of mountain landscapes, tubes of oil paint with Boulder Art Supply price tags still attached, and beneath the clothing, wrapped in what had once been a red plaid blanket, human remains that forensic experts would later identify through dental records as Mark Ellison. But it was the smaller items that raised the most questions. A silver chain with a distinctive Celtic knot pendant, a torn letter, its ink faded but still partially legible, a photograph of two people standing near the cabin itself, a young woman and a man who clearly resembled the missing person descriptions from 1972. Detective Amanda Rodriguez, who had reopened several cold cases since joining the Park County Sheriff's Department, studied the evidence with growing amazement. "This isn't random," she told the Chens as they watched investigators carefully catalogue each item. "Someone took great care preserving these things. This was meant to be found someday." As news of the discovery spread through the mountain communities, long-buried memories began surfacing. Local residents who had been children in the 1970s recalled stories their parents had whispered about the Holloway family's sudden departure. A few remembered Mark Ellison's disappearance, though most had assumed he'd simply gotten lost in the wilderness. The cabin, which had seemed like such a bargain to the Chens, now stood as a monument to questions that spanned more than 5 decades. Every room felt different now that they knew what lay beneath the floor. Every shadow carried the weight of secrets finally exposed to mountain sunlight. Denver, Colorado, November 2025. The torn letter found in Mark Ellison's makeshift grave contained only fragments of sentences, but those fragments were enough to shatter a family's carefully maintained silence. Forensic document experts worked for weeks to enhance the faded ink, using specialized lighting and chemical treatments to reveal words that time had nearly erased. What they found was a love letter, passionate, desperate, and signed with an initial that looked like an R. "Can't keep meeting like this. Father would never understand. Meet me at the cabin before Sunday. If we leave together, no one has to know." Detective Rodriguez cross-referenced the handwriting with old-school records from Boulder High. The match was unmistakable. Ruth Holloway, Mark Ellison's former student, had written the letter sometime in September 1972. She was 17 at the time. He was 28. Ruth Holloway, now Ruth Brennan, lived in a modest ranch house in Lakewood, a Denver suburb. At 71, she had built a quiet life as a retired librarian, never married, with no children. Her neighbors knew her as someone who kept to herself, but always had time to help with community garden projects or neighborhood watch duties. When Detective Rodriguez knocked on her door that gray November morning, Ruth's first words were, "I've been waiting for this conversation for 53 years. The truth, as Ruth finally told it, was both simpler and more complex than anyone had imagined. She and Mark had indeed fallen in love during her senior year, a relationship that began with after-school art lessons and evolved into something that terrified them both. In 1972, such relationships carried devastating consequences. Mark would lose his teaching career and likely face criminal charges. Ruth would be expelled from school and disowned by her deeply religious father. "We tried to end it several times," Ruth explained, her voice steady despite the magnitude of her confession. "But we couldn't stay away from each other. Mark was brilliant, kind, and he saw something in my art that even I didn't know was there. I was 17, but I felt like I'd found the person I was meant to spend my life with." Their plan had been desperate but simple: meet at her family's cabin, drive to California together, and start a new life where no one knew their history. Mark would find work as a freelance artist. Ruth would finish high school and apply to art colleges. They had saved money for months, planning every detail, but Thomas Holloway had discovered the relationship. Ruth never explained how. Perhaps he'd found one of Mark's letters, or noticed her absences, or simply sensed the change in his daughter's behavior. On Saturday, September 16th, he confronted Mark at the cabin where the couple had planned to meet. "My father was not a violent man," Ruth insisted, "but he was protecting his family's reputation, his business, what he saw as his daughter's future." The confrontation, it got heated. Mark tried to leave, to end the whole situation peacefully, but my father, her voice broke for the first time. "There was an accident. Mark fell. hit his head on the stone hearth. When my father checked on him, Mark was gone. Thomas Holloway had panicked. Instead of calling for help or reporting the accident, he'd made a decision that would haunt his family for decades. He buried Mark's body beneath the cabin floor, sealed the evidence in a handmade trunk, and told Ruth that Mark had simply left town without her. "I waited for him for months," Ruth whispered. "I thought he'd abandoned me, that everything we'd planned together meant nothing to him. It wasn't until years later, when my father was dying, that he told me the truth. By then, there was nothing I could do except carry the secret." The investigation revealed that Thomas Holloway had indeed acted alone. Ruth had been at school the day Mark died, with dozens of witnesses to confirm her whereabouts. Her father had created an elaborate story about Mark's departure to protect his daughter from becoming an accessory after the fact. Medical examination of Mark's remains confirmed Ruth's account: a single blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with an accidental fall, no evidence of intentional violence or struggle, a tragic confrontation that had spiraled beyond anyone's control. As winter settled over the Colorado mountains in 2025, the Mark Ellison case was officially closed. Ruth Brennan faced no charges, the statute of limitations had long expired, and prosecutors found no evidence of her involvement in either Mark's death or its cover-up. Thomas Holloway had taken his secret to the grave in 1998, never knowing that his carefully hidden evidence would eventually be discovered. The old Holloway cabin was demolished in December 2025. Sarah and Michael Chen, the couple who had unwittingly uncovered a 53-year-old secret, decided to build their dream home on a different piece of property. Some secrets, they agreed, were too heavy for the foundation of a new beginning. But Ruth Brennan visits the site occasionally, bringing flowers that she places where the cabin's front door used to stand. She talks to Mark sometimes, telling him about the art she's created over the decades, the students she's mentored, the life she built while carrying his memory. The mountain wind carries her words up into the aspens, where leaves still turn gold every autumn, just as they did in 1972, when two people fell in love and paid a price neither of them had anticipated. The case of Mark Ellison reminds us that some mysteries endure not because the truth is unknowable, but because the truth is too painful for those who live with it to speak aloud. Sometimes justice comes not through punishment, but through the simple act of allowing a story to finally be told, complete and honest, under the same wide sky where it began,